I'm Laura Bonnell, and this is the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast coming to you from Detroit. Please subscribe and even rate and comment on our podcasts when it moves you. I learn something new with every podcast, and I'm always inspired by the people that are showcased here. We don't give medical advice. You need to connect with your doctor for that. I hope that this Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast educates you and sparks some volunteering or advocacy. The CF community needs people like you. Thanks to our sponsors, Viatris and Vertex, for their support. Dr. Gabe Cohn is the Executive Director and Medical Director of the Rosenau Family Research Foundation, or RFRF. He joined in October 2 years ago, and he is a licensed board-certified clinical geneticist and obstetrician gynecologist with more than 30 years of experience in academic medicine and the biotech industry, and has contributed to the development of multiple therapeutics for the treatment of rare genetic disorders. And in addition to his role at RFRF, he serves as the Chief Medical Officer at iECURE Incorporated, which is a biotech company that is focused on developing gene editing therapies for rare genetic diseases. And I learned about the Rosenau Family Foundation just a few months ago. They improve the lives of patients that are impacted through Krabbe disease and cystic fibrosis, and they help with research funding and disease advocacy, and they are based in Wisconsin. And welcome, Gabe. Of course, you're Dr. Cohn, as I said in the introduction, but you said your friends call you Gabe, so that's what I'm going to do. So thank you. It's great to have you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Laura. Pleasure to be here.
I always love meeting new people. You've opened up a whole new area of cystic fibrosis and Krabbe for me that I was not aware of. And now I can't stop hearing about Krabbe. And I wasn't aware of it before. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Let's start by talking about the foundation and how it did become this kind of dream come true thanks to the Powerball ticket for the founders. If you want to explain that story, it was big in Minnesota back then.
Yes, it was. And the family's made a tremendous impact on Krabbe disease. As you said, this is a condition that a lot of people didn't know of. A lot of people weren't doing research in. There weren't any therapies. And so this kind of dates back to around 2008. 2008, the Rosenau Family Research Foundation was established as a 501c3. It's a private family foundation. And it had been established by Paul Rosenau and his late wife, Susan Rosenau, after Paul won a Powerball in May 4th of 2008. Now, that date happened to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the passing of their granddaughter, Michaela Lynn Pike, who had unfortunately succumbed to Krabbe disease at 2 years of age. After Michaela had been diagnosed, the family had also had a genetic workup, and they also found out that cystic fibrosis also runs in the family. And so the foundation basically supports in their mission both cystic fibrosis as well as Krabbe disease, which is basically how we wound up meeting.
Right.
At the time that they won the Powerball, they realized they had an opportunity to make an impact and make some sense of their granddaughter's early death. And they're people of faith, and so they viewed their winning not necessarily as luck, but it's an opportunity to shine light on this disease, to infuse funding in terms of research funding, as well as finding therapies and treatments and also advocacy in these conditions. So that's basically the story behind it. So really, despite the tragedy in their family, they were able to view the Powerball winning as something to really help the community and to help advance our knowledge about this disease and advancing treatments and therapies so that families don't necessarily have to go through what they did.
And, I watched the video a couple times. I just love the story. And when he said, that Susan asked him, did you get a ticket? And he's like, I don't know, I think so. And then he just casually checked and said, yeah. And then they showed the picture that was in the paper that they had won. And do you remember offhand how many millions it was?
I don't, but I do know that they put in the maximum amount that they were legally allowed to into this particular foundation.
That is wonderful. I mean, it's great for all of us that are impacted either by Krabbe or cystic fibrosis. And can you explain just a little bit more what Krabbe disease is?
Sure. So Krabbe disease, like cystic fibrosis, is a genetic disorder. It's much less frequent. Approximately 1 in 1,000 newborns are born with Krabbe disease. As with cystic fibrosis, it's inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern, which means that you could have two parents who are carriers and may not even know that they're carriers. And there's a 1 in 4 chance of actually having this disease, if indeed they are carriers, of having, I should say, a child with this disease. The reason for Krabbe disease, or the underlying pathology, is a genetic alteration, a genetic variant, genetic mutation that results in a deficiency in an enzyme called galactocerebrosidase, or GALC. And that particular enzyme is very important in breaking down certain fat molecules, and specifically fat molecules that surround sort of the insulation of our nerves. So our nerves are surrounded by what's called myelin sheaths. And if we can't turn that over appropriately, then what happens is, as you all would well imagine, it begins to break down. So if you think about sort of electrical currents and how they work, is we need sort of an insulator in order for that electric current to propagate effectively through a wire. And our nerves work the same way, with that myelin sheath almost serving as that covering of the wire, if you will, that insulation. When that breaks down, it means that the nerve signal can't propagate properly. And as a result, that can affect the peripheral nerves, and that could also affect the CNS, or the brain. And so what happens is that as a result of this, one sees these significant neurologic impairment and even death early on in life. And so there's several different forms. There's what's called early infantile onset, and that's typically occurs very early in life, with death occurring around 2 years of age, and it can range anywhere from 8 months to 9 years of age. There's a late onset Krabbe disease, which is a bit of a slower decline. But once neurologic symptoms occur, it's thought that death typically can occur 8 years after symptoms begin. And there's an adult onset where, again, we can see significant neurologic impairment, but those individuals can live 30 to 50 years after diagnosis. And again, the severity and the type of symptoms people experience really depends on these various subtypes of this condition.
Just so sad, and knowing their granddaughter died so young. I mean, it's just so sad. But, you know, like you've said, and like they've said, they did something to help. It's such a beautiful thing. And that's like really what brings us all together, appreciating all the work that everyone has done to get to where we are today. But before we get back to the Rosenau Foundation, I just want to say I'm so impressed by you and who you are. And I do think it's really important if we can just, you know, talk about you for just a little bit, because what you've done in your lifetime, and as far as I know, you do not have a sibling or anybody that has either Krabbe or cystic fibrosis. And you have done so much. And I wanted to ask you about, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but iECURE.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
It's iECURE, but
okay. iECURE. So it's a biotech company. Tell us about why you're in this and what you've done in biotech that keeps you going, just keeps your interest up in science and everything.
Sure. Yeah, so going back to the foundation, because it does tie in, I joined the foundation a little over 2 years ago. I was fortunate enough to be recruited again. As you said, sort of a great mission, family that's really committed to doing what's necessary to help eventually cure this disease. And our mission statement, really for families and those impacted by Krabbe disease and cystic fibrosis, to live a life basically not defined by Krabbe disease and cystic fibrosis. Really a wonderful mission, wonderful group of individuals. And so I had joined, and I had previously, to your point, worked in various biotech companies. I started off in academic medicine, being chief of genetics at a hospital and a health system where we were responsible for taking care of patients with genetic disorders, families with genetic disorders, and that included prenatal, pediatric, adult patients, as well as cancer genetic patients as well. And at the time when I was practicing, we were pretty good at being able to diagnose people, but we had very few treatment options available. And as my career advanced, again, I also should mention I was involved in basic science as well as translational science, trying to get a better understanding of these things. trying to help develop diagnostics. But as my career advanced, again, some therapies were being developed and we were beginning to introduce those into this health system that I was working in. A few years afterwards, I was actually approached by a biotech company interested in recruiting me to join the organization. And, again, being frustrated with being able to diagnose but not being able to do much, I thought this was an opportunity for me to contribute as well, sort of in this new burgeoning field of therapeutics and genetics. So I switched over to, again, the biotech industry and have worked in a number of different companies, either with what's called enzyme replacement therapy or cellular therapy or gene therapies in the hope of advancing these treatments. Some have been successful, some not so successful. And that's typical in the biotech industry, where even when you've been successful in terms of the laboratory development, what we call preclinical and non-clinical development, once it gets into clinic, a lot of times there's about a 90% chance that actually whatever drug you introduce will never get to approval, and only about a 10% chance. So again, it's a roller coaster ride, and the odds are very tough. But again, it's necessary in order for us to develop these treatments for these rare diseases for which we have no other therapies. So that's a bit of my background in terms of iECURE. So I mentioned I joined the foundation about a little over 2 years ago, and I was also doing some biotech consulting. And at the time, I was approached by this company called iECURE, and start first as a consultant, but also to interview for the chief medical officer position. And I checked with the Rosenau family because I wanted to make sure that this was acceptable to them. That was my first commitment. And I certainly didn't want to abandon them. And not only because I'd just been there, but because, again, I thought that the mission was so incredible. And they were incredibly supportive. And, I reassured them that I felt that I could handle both. And they were incredibly supportive and thought, again, this was very, very important because iECURE also focuses on these rare, devastating diseases. iECURE right now, we have a clinical trial for a neonatal onset what's called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency or OTC deficiency, where we're evaluating a gene editing investigational product to determine whether or not that could eventually become a therapy for this disease, which if goes undiagnosed will basically kill about 50 to 75% of babies that are born with this condition. So again, kind of what drives you is, again, realizing that there's this tremendous need. And, again, the science behind it is fascinating, but really being able to do something that really can change people's lives for the better. And so, again, both of these organizations, the Rosenau Family Foundation, as well as the iECURE, kind of address that drive within me of being able to make a difference.
Well, it's incredible. I feel like if there isn't a book out there yet, there's going to be a book about you. So thank you for all you're doing, because we haven't even touched on all you've done in your whole life. But I know that's not what you want to talk about. But I appreciate you letting me just embarrass you a little bit, because it's really important and who you are is really cool. And I'm going to read more about you as well, because I love everything that you're doing. But getting back to the Rosenau Family Foundation, so what kind of research have they been doing since 2008, and what are you excited about for the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things is we look at research funding, and the way the organization has always looked at research funding is to be able to provide seed money for new ideas, which may not necessarily be funded by an organization like the NIH. Oftentimes when you apply for grant funding for NIH, you really have to have in your application already some established research and really solid results to be able to get that type of funding. And to generate that type of data requires money, and a lot of times that money isn't available. So the Rosenau Family Research Foundation has really been able to provide money along those lines for really new ideas, new innovative ideas, and they've been pretty successful, which I'll articulate in a couple of minutes. But just to give you a flavor, so as I mentioned, I joined just 2 years ago, so I look back historically, it's what's happened well before I ever joined. And so they began funding starting in 2009, and they funded over 65 grants and committed over $21 million in funding. About 13% of that has gone for cystic fibrosis research, 67% for Krabbe disease research as well. And again, kind of the difference between the disparity reflects, number one, is the applicant pool that we get. But I think the other thing is just there's some great organization like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that really funds a lot of cystic fibrosis research, and they've done wonderful wonderful work and really helped advance the field. But for researchers in crab A disease, there haven't been a lot of places for them to go. So they've come to our organization, our foundation, to be able to get that startup money basically for their research. The other thing is I should mention that about 90% of what's funded is for research, but another 10% are for educational programs as well. So that's something that the foundation funds as well, just from helping advocacy and helping create greater awareness as well. In terms of the type of research that's been funded, kind of breaks down in terms of research funding, it breaks down into a couple of different levels. Number one is basic research. So that's your typical laboratory research, just understanding the basic biology of things. Then there's translational research. And what translational research refers to is taking what you understand biologically, oftentimes studying that in animal models to see whether or not that can actually translate into humans, either getting a better understanding of what's happening in humans, or alternatively developing some of these therapies. And finally, some clinical research has been funded as well. And to give you a flavor of that, what do we mean by basic science and basic biology? Some of the research that's been funded has enhanced our understanding of the immune and inflammatory response. Because what we found is that in crab A disease, not only is there this breakdown of the myelin sheath, that insulation, because of, again, the abnormal breakdown in the fatty molecules, but that prompts a marked immune response, an inflammatory response. In fact, that contributes to the disease significantly. So having a better understanding of that and having a better understanding of how one can maybe modulate that response can lead to some improvements in outcomes, we hope. The other thing is that trying to understand at the very cellular level, the underlying pathology in terms of actually what's going on in the brain, in the central nervous system, as well as the peripheral nervous system, as well as the sort of the response we're seeing to treatment. So one of the things that's one of various forms of treatment, hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, people exploring gene therapies as well as other potential therapies. So really understanding what kind of response one sees at the cellular level is very important. That's really basic research. In addition to that, I mentioned this translational science research, and that's basically taking what's kind of working in the laboratory, but then seeing how you can apply that in the clinic. And some examples are newborn screening that apply to both cystic fibrosis and crab A disease. So some initiatives in terms of quality improvements in terms of the methodologies, finding new biomarkers, developing new assays, all of which are geared towards improving the predictive value of crab A disease and cystic fibrosis newborn screening. So that's important. So when we get a positive result, it's more likely to be positive as opposed to being negative. And that's the type of research that's been funded. New animal models and cell models of crab A disease so that we could have a more nuanced and refined understanding of these diseases as well as therapeutic response. And again, various therapeutic approaches as well. Either figuring out a unique way of delivering the enzyme that's missing to the CNS, to the brain, looking at gene and cell therapy approaches, even looking at immunotherapy. As I mentioned before, one of the things that we know now, based on the research that's been done, is the immune system is a significant contributor to this disease. So there's certain immune therapies that might be useful. And then looking at just, traditional small molecule drugs, including repurposing some drugs that are already out in the market. So that's sort of what I would call translational research that's being undertaken. And finally, I did mention some clinical research. And so there's some really interesting initiatives, for example, in cystic fibrosis. How do we improve patient and family education and communication around newborn screening, around the disease itself? Because that's always a challenge. We in medicine always have a different vocabulary and assume certain things of our patients and our families. And are there better ways that we can improve our communication and our education? And so that particular research is looking at that as an aim. The other thing is that, again, in crab A disease, as I mentioned, patients can be candidates for hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, but that has to occur very early on in life. One of the things we don't know is among those patients that do not receive that kind of treatment, depending upon the timing of things and the availability of a donor, what is the disease burden on those individuals, and kind of elucidating that better. So again, that's really gives you a little bit of a flavor of the type of research. It goes anywhere from bench to bedside, if you will, to families and patients that are impacted by these conditions.
When you talk about newborn screening, I know there's so much work to do, even with cystic fibrosis, because there's so many mutations and not every state tests for every mutation. So people are still being underdiagnosed, especially people of color. Did you find anything like that with crab A, or is it different?
Yeah, crab-A, there were a lot of challenges. So crab-A, back in the beginning of 2004, January 30th, 2004, the United States Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children finally voted to recommend the addition of newborn screening for infantile crab-A disease. That's a very early onset. Now, this had been many, many years in the making, and the crab-A community has been very vocal about trying to get this onto what's called a RUSP. That's basically what we call the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel. And that's a recommendation that eventually leads to newborn screening throughout the country, in every state in the country. Up until that time, there had been only a limited number of states that had been performing newborn screening for crab-A disease. So in cystic fibrosis, the challenge was identifying, to your point, certain types of mutations that are more prevalent in certain populations. In crab-A disease, we didn't even have the option in most states of even doing newborn screening. And what's happened is in newborn screening, they don't necessarily look at various genetic mutational variants. What they do is they do a biochemical assessment, first looking at enzymatic activity, looking to see whether or not that enzyme is deficient, or the enzymatic activity, I should say, how much that enzyme works. But unfortunately, the predictive value of that was less than ideal. And so there was research done, in part funded by the Rosenau Family Research Foundation, to look at a new biomarker. Back, it's not no longer new, but at the time it had been a biomarker called cytosine. And it was determined that that biomarker, once it reaches a certain threshold, is indicative of this infantile form of crab-A disease. So again, when the government looked at that data and looked at the outcomes and the interventions, they agreed to go forward with, again, the newborn screening for the infantile form of crab-A disease, because the test they felt was, the newborn screening was sufficient, to accurately predict those people who would be affected versus those who wouldn't be affected. So it really took those advancements to get even to this point. So in many ways, crab-A disease, not only from a treatment standpoint, but also from a diagnostic and screening standpoint, is really, if not a couple of decades behind cystic fibrosis in terms of a lot of the developments and advances.
Wow, that's interesting. But you're doing so much work, and I'm guessing catching up as fast as you can.
Yep. Thankfully, there are a number of really tremendous advocacy groups. Hunter's Hope has done a great job in terms of advocating for newborn screening. crab-A Connect is another one. We're a small organization, and so at least the past couple of years while I've been the executive director, I've always viewed it as the one thing, I shouldn't say the one thing, but one of the key drivers that we bring to the table is the ability to fund a lot of this research. And we've got an excellent scientific advisory committee that can guide us on evaluating these various grants. As mentioned, there are some great advocacy groups out there that are excellent in terms of the campaigns that are necessary to move these things forward. And what we do is we try to support those. They would take the lead. We support them in terms of attending the meetings, the letter writing campaigns, and the other and supporting financially those efforts. But it's not something that we necessarily take the lead on, not because it's not important, but again, just because there are other groups that are already doing a wonderful job. So we feel that we're much better at being able to support them while also moving forward with some of the research that I described before.
This is going to air in May, so your March program will be over by then, but please still tell us about that program so people can look forward to it and other programs that you have going on.
We do have a meeting. It's called the crab-A Translational Research Network. And this was something that was initiated by an investigator, Maria Escolar, at the time it was at the University of Pittsburgh. And it was funded actually as a grant by the Rosenau Family Research Foundation. Eventually, we wound up kind of taking the lead on this and hosting this and sponsoring it. And we've been doing so for many, many years. It's an annual meeting, typically occurs in March. And so as you pointed out, it'll be in the middle of March this year. And the focus for this year is I almost want to call it, even though it's a 2025 meeting, I want to call the meeting 2030. And the reason for that is we need to think as a community where we need to be in 2030. And by that, I mean, what we'd like to do is we're going to have scientific presentation in terms of where we are right now, what are our current advances in crab-A disease in terms of biomarkers, neurology, and therapeutics. And so the nice thing about this research network is it's actually open to all people who do research within the field. But it's an opportunity for crab-A disease researchers to really meet and interact with one another. And sometimes, what happens is you develop collaboration they may not ordinarily have an opportunity to be able to establish. And really, it's amazing some of the networking that occurs and some of the ideas that come together because you have people from different disciplines looking at the same issues from a different perspective. So again, the talks themselves are going to be predominantly, again, very scientific, biomarkers, neurology, therapeutics, and focused on the research advances of various experts within this field. But we also plan to have panel discussions, which will look at where we are currently, what are the gaps, and what are the needs. And that perspective will be provided by members of the community, so families, advocacy groups, as well as those who are involved in treatment, but also scientific medical perspectives. So separate discussion in terms of what are our gaps scientifically and medically that we need to address. And I'm hoping what we can do for the foundation, but also for the community as a whole, identify those areas that really we need to prioritize and address over the next 5 years so that this way we can be most effective in terms of focusing our efforts. And this will also help us as an organization determine which grants we should be really prioritizing. And that's based on sort of the experts' view of things, not necessarily our own view of things. So that's this March's meeting. If anybody's interested, go online, check our website.
Yes, and the link is in our show notes also. And I wonder if there's any stories you can share. I mean, like me, you meet so many families, and you with probably 2 diseases, you meet so many families. Is there a theme either out of frustration with something or that, wow, we're so glad, how Krabbe or CF is moving forward? Do you talk to a lot of parents and get a lot of good feedback?
I think, yes, I think it's a combination of both. I mean, it's bittersweet because there is appreciation for where we're going. As with any evolving field, there's setbacks, and that becomes very, very difficult and challenging. We do get letters. We will hear from families and parents. And again, it's being appreciative, but it's also hearing when there's a setback, just the frustration, and understandably so, and the disappointment. So it is a mixed bag. And one of the things that happens in our meetings also is that families come with their children to this meeting. And again, the researchers will come. A lot of them are bench researchers, and they view this as a great meeting to interact with families and really feel firsthand and understand firsthand the impact of this condition. And alternatively, the families can hear firsthand of the type of research that's happening, and again, can look forward to, again, a better future. So I think, again, in terms of our meeting, that it provides that opportunity for researchers and clinicians to meet families and vice versa and exchange the type of stories that you're referring to.
And it's so powerful. It's so powerful to meet with scientists, to meet with, researchers and other family members, to your people, really. It's a group of all your people that inspire you, and it's overwhelming. It's wonderful. But I would think from where you're sitting too, it must be so rewarding to see all these families.
It is, and it's also rewarding to see the impact that has, again, even among, you'll see like young researchers, these are people who are in the laboratory, they're studying for their PhDs, and when they meet the family, it just increases their level, their passion about what the work that they're doing, the importance of what they're doing, and also the urgency as well. So it is rewarding. And it's interesting, at least over the past couple of years, what we've seen an increase in the mix of new people coming to these meetings, newer people, in other words, people who hadn't necessarily been involved in these meetings and in our research grant funding, applying for grants, an increase in the number of people attending, an increase in the number of grants. And I think what happens is that it all feeds into one another, where, again, by having interactions with families, that makes a difference in the way one approaches things medically and scientifically. It doesn't become sort of an abstract thing out there, right? It's very personal, as you said, and it really makes an impact. And for the families themselves, again, I think it's an ability to understand what's happening, why certain things are happening, why certain things aren't happening. And again, it's information, but it also can provide some hope to see, again, new people, young people, established people really passionate about trying to solve this.
Is there anything that we didn't mention that you wanted to mention about the Rosenau Foundation or anything that's coming up?
I think the key really is one of the things that we are looking at and considering is how do we continue to grow as a network in terms of more researchers involved, more research that's going on. Again, I think we've done a good job doing that, but trying to continue to grow that and getting more people interested in this line of work. One of the things we started this summer is we're going to sponsor students to do internships at some established labs for them to get exposure to rare disease, which again, it's not only Krabbe disease, it's cystic fibrosis, a host of other rare diseases, and influence them early on in life to really consider this as a career, as a passion for them to move into. So that's another avenue that we're beginning to lay a foundation. So it's not just supporting the researchers of today, but hoping to develop an army of researchers for tomorrow that'll help advance this field and really make a difference in people's lives.
And that's interesting and wonderful that you said this, because the Bonnell Foundation, we started a fellowship program at the University of Michigan because they're seeing that fewer doctors are getting into chronic illness, which is not news to you, but it's really important we keep, sending people in and hoping that they do get involved in the rare diseases.
Yeah, and the people that I know that are in this field have, again, it ties back to being impacted by families, working directly with families when you're in clinical care, being a researcher where you have an opportunity to meet families. As you say, the stories and people's lives are tremendously impactful, really make a difference. And so the hope is by exposing individuals early on in life, this too will be a career path for them and, hopefully make a difference. Again, not only in Krabbe disease and cystic fibrosis, perhaps in related conditions as well. And that's the other thing we're also seeing. Some of our investigators also are finding connections to other more common neurodegenerative disorders. And so one of the things that we have to grapple as an organization is, do we begin to stretch ourselves in that direction? So again, I think the future is very exciting. There's certainly challenges involved, but we look forward to trying to tackle them.
And growth is very important. And just to speak it and say it out there is a really good idea. And it's kind of comforting just to know that growth is so important, because it is so important to an organization or a person. Keeps us all going.
There's still a lot more to learn. There's still a lot more to be done. One group can't do it by themselves. So it really is, it's important to recruit additional people to be able to help in this mission. And again, that's what we plan on doing, and hopefully be able to motivate people to really be passionate about this and really make a difference in people's lives.
Absolutely. I agree. And Dr. Gabe Cohn, thanks so much for sharing your story and the Rosenau Family Research Foundation. So thank you so much for sharing the story on both fronts.
Again, thank you very much for having me. Greatly appreciate it. And best of luck with your foundation and your work as well. You do wonderful things, so we really appreciate it as well.
Thank you so much.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, The Science of Possibility, and Viatris. It was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.